conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near and just passed right through me.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is Back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined once again by Murjani Rawls, and we have decided to talk about Howard the Duck. This was mostly my fault. It's all my doing. But Murjani, are you ready to talk about the 1986 film, Howard the Duck, which is known in Europe as Howard, a New Breed of Hero?
I've been singing the theme song this entire time.
I have not, thankfully.
Apologies. It's so catchy, though.
So, this movie, fascinating and terrifying on so many different levels. The fact that this came out in 1986, and you have a cast that would go on to be fairly recognizable, I would say, at least in the case of Leah Thompson, Tim Robbins, and I think Paul Guilfoyle is in like some network TV stuff, obviously Holly Robinson, and I'm not as familiar with some of the other people, but I know I've seen Jeffrey Jones and stuff, and it's just full of these honestly kind of character actors. Not to say that Tim Robbins didn't go on to, basically be the star of The Player and have a pretty big role in The Shawshank Redemption, but the fact that this movie somehow did not completely kill careers is also amazing.
Well, I mean, what is it? It's a 14 on Rotten Tomatoes?
Yeah, it was like 13 or 14. It was really bad.
I think it did kind of hurt. I know that, I was reading that, some of the cast, had trouble getting other parts right after this film.
Yeah. I know Leah Thompson was in the Back to the Future movies right around this same time, though, at least, so that probably helped a little. Yeah,
and it took a while for even Marvel to integrate the Howard the Duck character until they did it,
in Guardians of the Galaxy in, 2014.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the fact that they picked Howard the Duck as the character to just go all in on with this movie. And, the movie had a budget of around 30 to 37 million. It only made 38 million at the box office. So sure, it made back the budget, but at what cost kind of thing. And this was, Lucasfilm and Universal. So this was pre-Marvel Studios, pre-Disney owning Marvel, and it's obvious that they really wanted to go all in on the weird 80s vibe with this, and it didn't work. And you have Ed Gale as Howard the Duck in the suit, and you have Chip Zien as the voice, so it's just, I don't even know what to say about this one, really. It is mind-blowingly baffling.
Well, I mean, I'm about to age myself, but they used to show this movie on television on WP 11, which, I mean, I think I saw when I was younger, maybe once or twice. And obviously it was heavily edited.
Yeah.
Because if you watch the intended cut of this film, there's a lot that happens in the first 15 minutes that probably wouldn't get by censors. I would have to say, watching it when I'm older, this is one of the most oddly paced films I've ever seen in my life.
I tried so hard to just sit and focus only on this, but because it's almost 2 hours long, which is way too long for this kind of movie, this should have easily been 90-ish minutes, give or take. Not as many minutes as it was. It should have been at least 20 to 30 minutes shorter, in my opinion. But I think they tried to tackle quite a few things about the Marvel universe in this, because you have the idea of the multiverse in this, where there's this entire alternate duck world.
And it's just so funny because they're so in his world that we barely get into. We only really see 5 minutes of it. Yeah. And then there's allusions to it, but they don't really go into his background that much. There are alternate things like there's like Flashdance and like sitcoms that are like based on the human world. And it's funny because he works in advertising. So, and it didn't like when he's talking to Leah Thompson's character at first, he does an advertisement, and it seems like right in the beginning of the film when he like comes home, they try to cram as much IP to parody as much as possible.
Yeah.
Like I said, like the first 40 minutes of this film, like, is a love story. It seems like you don't even go into the crux of, or basically the setup for the villain until an hour in. But it's a love story between Howard and Beverly, essentially. That like I don't know. Like I was watching this film. I'm like, okay, we're going from Act 1 to Act 3 to Act 2, all in 20 minutes.
Yeah, there's so much that just gets crammed in like the last 30 minutes of the movie, because I was watching it and I was like, okay, you know, he's trying to help Beverly out and get rid of her manager, and they're doing all of this stuff, and you have Tim Robbins' character popping in and out trying to sort of solve the mystery of how Howard got there. And it's just, the pacing is not good at all in this. It starts pretty slow, especially once Howard is on this planet and he meets Beverly. He beats up those couple guys, and then they go through this whole little dance of waiting for the bus or whatever in the rain, and it's just, it's so bad.
The funniest thing about that part is when Howard helps Beverly and they're like, well, see ya, I guess I'll stay here. And then there's like there's this song that comes on. It's like singing like two friends. It's funny as hell. And then like she comes over. It's like, hey, do you need a place to stay? And that whole interaction is cheesy. I know that Howard the Duck, the comics were basically social satire. And if you look at this film as that, it's a little better. But like when they're in the apartment and he's sleeping and she's going through his wallet and finds like an open condom in there, which I'm like, okay, if it's open, you can't really use it. And she like sits next to him sleeping. She's like, what am I going to do with you, Ducky? And his pet name for her throughout the film is Toots. Yeah, there are a bunch of red flags that go throughout this film. The way the humans treat Howard is hilarious, but super inappropriate too.
Yeah, there's a lot of delayed reactions and then screams from women. And, you know, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for this, and the Golden Raspberry Awards nominated this for so many of the worst things, which I kind of don't love doing that with award shows, because it's kind of like to celebrate films and art usually. But it was nominated for Worst Picture, Worst Director, Worst Supporting Actor, Worst Screenplay, Worst New Star, Worst Original Song, and Worst Visual Effects. And then a few years later, it was nominated for Worst Picture of the Decade. But of all of those things it was nominated for, it won for Worst Picture, Screenplay, New Star, and Visual Effects. Which, okay, this is the 80s, so the visual effects, I didn't think were that bad in comparison to other movies of this time, because Industrial Light and Magic have always sort of been at the top of their game, at least with a lot of the stuff that I've seen that company has worked on. And obviously we now know Lucasfilm for much different things, mostly Star Wars. I mean, still at the time they were mostly known for Star Wars, but when you think of Lucasfilm now, you think of a much higher quality than this movie.
I will say that the Howard the Duck suit was pretty good.
Yeah, I didn't have a problem with how Howard the Duck looked in this, because the stuff that is practical is almost always going to stand the test of time. And it makes sense that they literally put a person in the Howard the Duck suit, because we had seen Lucasfilm do that with Star Wars in particular prior to this. You know, there were 3 movies, and the practical effects are the reasons why a lot of people still love watching movies from this time period.
Even the stuff with Jennings, the physical effects on Jennings wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
I guess the special effects,
the glowing was a bit much.
with the glowing eyes, that was a lot. And also, I know with the demon at the time, a lot of those 80s movies did like the stop motion type things with villains. Like I remember The Gate had one with the big demon, kind of like this. At times that the demon looked okay, but then there were other times where you're like, oh wow, this looks like a video game in a physical location. So we know, Industrial Light and Magic for being at that time like the gold standard of special effects, but they were clearly working out kinks in this movie. Especially with, Jennings and the demon, and how he was raining lightning bolts on the people in the diner, and the final act where they destroy kind of like the big gun ray, which was clearly inspired by Ghostbusters. We have to close the portal, and like there was like these big lobster things that are coming down, which when they clicked, did you notice when they clicked their when they moved, it sounded like gunshots?
Yeah, there was a lot of weird stuff about this movie, but just for anyone who might not be familiar outside of Star Wars, some of the other stuff that ILM worked on, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., Poltergeist, The Goonies, Star Trek movies, they worked on Back to the Future just a year before this. And sure, there's some stuff in Back to the Future, like the lightning or whatever, that doesn't hold up as well. But, a lot of these things were roughly 40 years ago. So things have come a long way since then. But to have this just like in between something like Back to the Future and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it's just like, this makes no sense at all. But it is what it is. It's a movie that somehow got made. And here's the thing about even bad movies. Someone gave this movie roughly $30 million to get made. So someone consciously made this decision.
I know that person's kicking themselves.
But the fact that they still managed to pull it off, not necessarily that it was good, but that it was a movie that came out, even the bad movies are sort of miracles. And even if the general public, like you and I, are completely baffled by these decisions, Marvel wasn't, I don't want to say they weren't as big of a name in the 80s, because obviously there were plenty of people reading comics in the 80s. But as far as, in the TV and movie landscape, sure, there had been Marvel stuff before this, but I just don't think Howard the Duck was the right character. It's like Marvel Studios took a chance making Iron Man, making the Hulk and Iron Man sort of the first 2 characters that they kicked everything off with, because they weren't Spider-Man. They weren't the X-Men. They didn't have the rights to their sort of big 2 groups of characters, so they had to improvise, and thankfully for them, it paid off. It really paid off. But you have a character like Howard the Duck, who even now isn't a super popular character, and it's just such an odd choice, because I can't figure out who this movie was targeted to. Like, it doesn't seem like it was targeted to Marvel fans. And it doesn't seem like it was targeted to the same people who watched, Star Wars or Indiana Jones or E.T. or anything. Maybe E.T. a little bit, maybe Back to the Future fans, but I'm not sure who the audience for this movie was supposed to be in the 80s.
I know that George Lucas really wanted to produce it after he did American Graffiti, but kind of going off what you just said, I could be wrong in 1986, but I don't know who was really clamoring for a Howard the Duck movie. I know that people maybe get a kick out of him being in Guardians and even in What If, but they're still not clamoring for, like, hey, let's get a Howard the Duck movie on in the MCU. I know Leah Thompson, like, pitched it to Marvel, and they were like, no thanks. This movie seems to try to get everybody in the net, and in that respect, it does nothing well. Because it tries to get like a raunchy side, a comedical side, especially with the amount of one-liners that Howard the Duck kind of lands. And it also tries to do a romance story between Howard and Beverly that kind of comes off weird. I mean, other than the obvious thing of like a human and a duck possibly canoodling together, it's just, it does a lot of it. If you look at it as like a funny way to play on romantic 80s rom-com tropes, okay, you could look at it that way. But it seems like it's trying to do everything. A sci-fi film, a musical film, too, with, you know, Beverly's Band and things that, like, it tries to do so many things and tackle so many genres. I don't, like, in the third act, I don't know how long that airplane scene went through. It went to 15, it had to go to 15 minutes. And it was like, okay, well, Jennings and the Demon are gonna, that plan is gonna happen before they even get there.
Yeah.
So, like, it's like scenes ran too long. Like, they tried to do everything at once and it just didn't hit. And also, I believe this is the first Marvel movie, Universal in partnership with Marvel. This is the first character that they did other than Captain America in, like, 1944. I don't think that I would have led with this, even though, you know, somebody like Lucas obviously has pull because he did Star Wars, you know, and he was doing, you know, Indiana Jones and things at the time. So, I just don't know who was, like, beating down the doors of, like, we need a Howard the Duck movie.
Yeah, I am not sure either, but it does look like the director and writer, who were married, did not get a whole lot of work after this. They did one more thing together in 1994, it looks like, but nothing in the film world between Howard the Duck and that. And this was one of those things where maybe the cast didn't get the backlash quite as much. And a lot of the main characters in this were pretty young. You know, Leah Thompson and Tim Robbins weren't that old in the 80s. So it's not like they had these big careers already. Their careers were more so just starting out, it felt like. And I think that maybe kind of saved them.
Yeah, the one thing I will say about this movie is that the cast is trying to do the best that they can with the material that they're given. You know, again, yeah. I'm sorry. It's just thinking back on this film, you know, Jeffrey Jones, like, he leans into the transformation of Walter Jennings. He goes from, you know, curious doctor to a guy that's being inhabited by an otherworldly demon and completely leans into it. I will give him that.
Yeah. And he did Ferris Bueller's Day Off the same year as this. So, you know, that's just wild to think about.
Well, maybe he's thankful that movie came out at that time.
Yeah.
So it could overshadow this one. Like Tim Robbins as like the overly, you know, trying to be scientific, you know, they're trying. Leah Thompson is trying, even though, like, after we see her on stage, like the first scene that we see her, she is being subject to sexual harassment. Where I'm like, whoa, whoa. Like I know that, you know, it leads Howard the Duck to be like this guy in Duck Fu, where he beats up a lot of people in this film, but in the diner, you know, he almost gets eaten by a like a mob, which is, I'm like, wow, okay, he can't just fight himself off. But yeah, it's like the cast has to do so many tonal shifts in Howard the Duck that it's almost dizzying.
Yeah. And we should note that Jeffrey Jones had his own problems later on and was arrested for child pornography. So that is super fun. Hollywood is something else.
Yeah,
and
it's something.
He still continued to get work.
Yeah, he was in Beetlejuice.
Yeah, this happened
in 2003.
Yeah, it was like early 2000s when this happened, but he's still got work after that. And, you know, obviously...
He was in Deadwood?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, he's definitely the guy who had been in a lot of things in comparison to, I think, a good chunk of the cast. But Howard the Duck, I cannot say I had a good time with it because this wasn't even one of those bad movies that was fun to watch. It was just bad and painful to watch.
I thought it was just hilarious. I found it to be hilarious because of how bad it was. Because there were many instances of what the fuck in me. Because when you revisit things, because like when I was a kid, like I was just like, oh, there's a cartoon duck who like is like going around saving the world, right? I didn't see like, oh, it's a will they, won't they romantic bit between him and Beverly, and then noticing how like bad the special effects were, and the many instances of just, I guess, I don't even know what to call it, like duck appropriation and like harassment that happens in this movie.
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, like, are they trying, it looks like they were trying to get as close to the rated R as possible without going over it, but also making it of like, hey, like, maybe kids can see this too, even though there's like a nude duck in a bathtub within first 5 minutes of the film.
Yeah. It was not good.
Yeah, I was just, yeah.
Unfortunately, it honestly tried to do too much, and it's not that I don't think a Howard the Duck movie could work. It was just not the right character to start with. And who knows if they even wanted to do more Marvel movies at this point. But still, even if you're just doing one-off movies, you don't start with Howard the Duck. You have to introduce something like Guardians of the Galaxy that's a little weird and a little out there and has a talking raccoon, so that you can sort of build your way up to a character like Howard the Duck, especially given the fact that a lot of Howard the Duck stuff is not very appropriate for, you know, basically any children at this point. You know, you have to find a way, like they did in Guardians, to introduce the character without really introducing the character, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think that in a world now where we have Deadpool, that there's a way to do it, and an outlet like Hulu that like has done like these one shoots of like MODOK and things of like with like the animated features, you can do that. And I think there was one proposed for Howard the Duck. But one flaw that I saw in this film is that, you know, the ongoing thread is like, I have to get home. I have to get home to like the planet I was. And we pretty much learned nothing about the planet. The only instance that we see like his work where, you know, he said that he was in medical school where he was, and then he dropped out, and then now he's like this advertising guy. Is like, well, why do you want to go back home other than it being your home? Is it in danger? Is there a reason why you can't be in the human world? Even though, I mean, people do treat him horribly, like either as a pet or like, oh my God, like he's weird. But I think anybody would, if you saw like a 3-foot duck walking around that talks to you, but there's no connection or learning about where he's from. So it's just like, okay, like we have to, he's like, I'm off, I'm on the way. Like, and I think this trope has been done in a lot of films, but they at least give him the backstory to like, okay, are there parents back there that he loves? Are there like, other than just, well, I'm in a duck world that seems just to be a parody of ours. Like, what is it for? And the film doesn't really do that. The song at the end is catchy though, and I think there's like a slight post-credit scene of Beverly and Howard kind of being romantic with each other, and then it ends.
Yeah, it's like after the concert or whatever.
It's our first stinger, yeah. So other than that, it's just, if you wanted to do funny, I guess you did do funny, but at the same time, it's just like there's no connective tissue for me other than, the wisecracking antics of Howard and him kind of being in love with Beverly for me to connect with that character.
Yeah, I don't know why I suggested doing this. I just sometimes have very bad ideas and decide to do them. But I think we can move on to recommendations now. Safe to say, don't watch this. So instead, I'm just going to recommend you check out Guardians of the Galaxy, because that movie is way more fun and you still get a little bit of Howard the Duck at the end there.
My recommendation is go see Multiverse of Madness. I'm interested to hear a lot of people's opinions about it. I have my own. I don't want to get into spoiler detail. As far as it being a Sam Raimi movie, love it. Love it because, he's done stuff like, if you ever seen Drag Me to Hell, he can do PG-13 horror very well, and I love that it looks like Feige gave him the reins to do that. But the multiverse stuff, I would say that if you're expecting a lot from it, you might be a little disappointed. But I recommend you to go see it anyway.
Yeah, that's on my list to do soon. Hopefully sooner rather than later, but we'll see. And Murjani, thank you so much for suffering through Howard the Duck with me.
My pleasure.